Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by Allianz. My name is Sarah, and I'm the Senior Fleet Officer here at Brake and part of Brake's global fleet team, where we work with fleet operators and suppliers to share resources and best practices across the industry. Driving whilst tired is high risk, and fatigue is a factor in a large number of crashes. Fatigue, like other impairments such as alcohol and drugs, affects driving. However, whilst drug and alcohol impairment can be measured to identify risk, measuring fatigue is difficult. Fatigue is particularly dangerous because it can affect anyone, regardless of how experienced a driver they are. Outback drivers can be particularly at risk, especially if they spend long hours driving, drive at night, or have irregular sleep schedules. In today's webinar, our academic and practitioner speaker lineup will discuss the causes of driver fatigue and the importance of including it in your road risk programme, sleep disorders such as sleep apnea and how they are identified, measures to help employers identify drivers who may be at risk of fatigue, and measures to raise awareness of fatigue through education and communication programmes. You should all now be able to see my presentation and hear the audio alongside it. As attendees, you are all muted, so you don't need to worry about any background noise from your offices. And there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions towards the end of the webinar, and there are two ways in which you can do this. Firstly, there is a chat box on the webinar panel where you can send your question at any point during the webinar. And secondly, there is a raise hand icon on the same panel. You can press this during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentations and we will unmute you. And you can put your question to the panel then directly over the phone. Today we will be hearing presentations by Paul Jackson, Head of Impairment Research at TRL, David Lee, Clinical Director at Sleep Unlimited, Steve Duffy, Senior Delivery Manager at Network Rail, Mark Sherman, Commercial Motor Manager at Allianz. Set up and founded in 1995, Brake is a national road safety charity that exists to stop the needless deaths and serious injuries that happen on roads every day, make streets and communities safer for everyone, and care for families bereaved and injured in road crashes. Brake's vision is quite simple: a world that has zero road deaths and injuries, and a world where people can get around in ways that are safe, sustainable, fair, and healthy. We promote road safety awareness, safe and sustainable road use, and effective road safety policies through campaigns, community education, information and advice for organisations operating fleets of vehicles, and road safety professionals. And of course, by running the UK's flagship road safety event, Road Safety Week. We also provide essential support to people across the UK devastated by road death and serious injury to help them in their darkest hours. So in terms of support, we run a quality accredited free phone helpline in the UK for people bereaved and seriously injured in road crashes. You can see some more information on the level of support we gave in 2017 on your screen now. In addition to the helpline, we also provide support literature and work very closely with police forces throughout the UK so that when someone does receive that knock on the door from a family liaison officer, they are providing them with best practice support literature. We campaign nationally and regionally to raise awareness among the public and to lobby government and push for change in road safety legislation. An example of this is our 2016 Roads to Justice campaign, which centred around getting justice for bereaved families. This UK campaign launched outside Parliament and gained a lot of media attention, and I'm sure most of you will have seen the changes to criminal driving sentencing announced in October 2017. We are now, of course, lobbying the UK government to make sure those changes are introduced. We also do a lot of campaigning more generally on raising awareness of a range of topics, some of which you can see on the screen now. Awareness raising and education in communities is delivered through projects such as Road Safety Week, the UK's flagship road safety event, which you can find out more about by visiting roadsafetyweek.org.uk. Each year, Brake helps hundreds of companies run road safety projects in their communities and inspire children to be safe on our roads. We have well-established events and resources to help you run activities locally to your business, and our community engagement team can help put you in touch with local schools and nurseries and give you advice on how to talk to different age groups. Or your company can work with Brake to establish your very own community project. We also share training tools and guidance on global fleet safety best practice through our Brake Professional membership service. We provide our members with tools to manage occupational road risk, regardless of budget, fleet size, or vehicle type. We run an annual calendar of events, including webinars such as today's, and seminars and training throughout the year. We also have annual flagship events such as our Fleet Safety Conference and Fleet Safety Awards. In addition to these events, we also produce a lot of resources for employers, including guidance reports on introducing policies and sharing best practice case studies. Alongside that, we provide employers with tools to use directly with their drivers. You can see on the screen now some of the posters, infographics and videos which you can use to engage your own drivers. I'd now like to introduce Mark Sherman, Commercial Motor Manager at Allianz, who are kindly sponsoring today's webinar.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Sherman. I'm a Commercial Motor Manager at Allianz. I was very pleased when Brake asked me to contribute towards this webinar on driver fatigue. As we all know, most incidents are understandable, predictable and preventable. It therefore follows that taking effective action will minimise the occurrence of incidents. At Allianz, we've seen an increasing focus in road risk management, and there are a number of reasons for this. Some include the impact of the claims culture we have in the UK, increasing regulation around health and safety, a better understanding of the cost to a business when an incident occurs, and the unpredictability in the business environment currently. Today's challenging economic climate is squeezing business, and as a result, companies must look at efficiencies and consider how it can reduce operational costs to remain competitive. This includes new technologies as well as driver and vehicle utilisation. However, in doing so, business must remember that they have a regulatory duty of care which extends to include the safety of journeys driven on behalf of business. Creating greater awareness of risk is key to reducing incidents, and Allianz are therefore pleased to support this Brake webinar on driver fatigue, which will focus on how tiredness can affect the safety of drivers and other road users, as well as looking into the identification of symptoms and what methods and technologies can be employed to prevent an unwanted incident. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mark there from Allianz for those opening remarks. We will now hear from Paul Jackson, who will be providing an introduction to the causes and consequences of driver fatigue.
Good afternoon, my name is Paul Jackson, and I'm here to give you an introduction to the issue of driver fatigue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the causes of fatigue and how that impacts on drivers, and then look at some of the consequences. Just to give you a bit of background before we begin though, I am a psychologist working at the Transport Research Laboratory, TRL, and TRL employs about 300 engineers and scientists and psychologists and statisticians, all focused on developing innovative strategies and approaches for managing and improving road safety. As I said, I'm a chartered psychologist. My area of expertise or specialism is fatigue, drugs, distraction, all those things that can affect driving behaviour and safety. I've been working in this area for about 25 years, working with clients mainly in safety critical industries, so aviation, road transport, as well as mining, oil and gas, and some work with the emergency services, particularly the police. For all of those clients, I've been helping them to develop fatigue risk management systems. In addition to that, over the last 20 years or so, I've also been involved in a number of cases where a driver is suspected of having fallen asleep at the wheel. And my role is to give a view as to whether fatigue was the cause of the crash. Currently, I'm head of impairment research at TRL, and as part of that, I lead TRL's driver wellbeing program, which is a program trying to improve safety and identify some of the main contributors to poor driver well-being, specifically fatigue and stress, and how those impact on driver mental well-being. Today, I'm going to talk in detail about fatigue and how it affects drivers. I'm going to start with an explanation of the different types of fatigue. I'll begin with the definition, and then we'll look at some of the different forms of fatigue, which I think is important for us to understand so that we can really start to drill down into the main contributors to the problem. That'll lead us onto a discussion of the causes, the main causes of fatigue, which center around sleep and lack of sleep. I'll then move on to how these problems affect performance, and specifically how they translate into driving behavior. And finally, I'm going to look at some of the costs of fatigue. I think one of the big problems in this area is that most organizations don't really calculate the true costs of fatigue, which means that often they will continue to operate in particular ways which may be causing or contributing to the problem. If we think about driver fatigue, over the last 20 to 30 years, various governments and road safety organizations have undertaken research which has helped us understand the extent of the problem. In the UK, the Department for Transport has undertaken considerable research in this area, and that has highlighted that at least 1 in 5 crashes on motorways and major trunk roads is related to driver fatigue. Unfortunately, these crashes tend to be more severe than other crashes, specifically because drivers who are experiencing fatigue tend to drive at high speed. In other words, they don't brake, and they take no avoidance action. Obviously, if you're experiencing a microsleep, a temporary bout of sleepiness, it is likely that you will collide with oncoming traffic or traffic which is stationary, and you may not even see that traffic. As a result of this, these crashes tend to be much more likely to result in death or serious injury than other types of crash. The research we've undertaken in the UK and elsewhere around the world has highlighted certain groups who are much more likely to be involved in these collisions than others. They tend to be male, they tend to be in the 18 to 30 bracket, and certain professions are more represented or overrepresented in these collisions. Shift workers obviously would be one group, but also skilled trades, people who are driving long distances to get to work, who then have a very busy day and who then drive long distances to get back home. And of course, business drivers who, for similar reasons, may have issues relating to fatigue. So what do we mean by fatigue? Well, this definition, I think, is a very, very useful one. It comes from the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, but is just as relevant for other industries. And the reason I like this definition is because it focuses our attention on some of the causes and some of the consequences. It begins by stating that fatigue is a physiological state. In other words, it's a need state. So just as when you're hungry, you need food, and when you're thirsty, you need water, when you're suffering from fatigue, ultimately you need sleep. It also highlights that this has consequences for mental and physical performance. Secondly, it talks about some of the main causes of fatigue, and particularly looking at sleep loss or being awake for long periods of time, extended wakefulness. And then circadian phase, the time of day at which we're performing. We know that there are certain times of the day when, as humans, our alertness is naturally lower than it would be at other times. And then finally, workload. And then it goes on to talk about some of the consequences. The fact that fatigue can impair our alertness and our ability to safely operate or perform safety-related duties. One of the things I've tried to look at for this particular presentation is the different types of fatigue. And I think one of the problems that many people face is trying to identify what aspects of fatigue are causing problems for their operation. And I think there are 4 particular types of fatigue that we can focus on. Firstly, as I just mentioned, the majority of fatigue results from sleep-related problems. And we can distinguish between transient fatigue or acute fatigue, the kind of fatigue that results from one night of poor sleep. So if, for example, last night I had a bad night of sleep because my young child was keeping me awake, then it's likely that today I'll be experiencing transient fatigue. And the point of this is that a good night's sleep or 2 good nights of sleep should help me recover from that transient fatigue. Cumulative fatigue is where we don't get that recovery. And for many people working in shifts, who work shift work, or who work in road transport specifically, this can be a particular problem. Working many days in a row and getting less sleep than we need for many days in a row results in cumulative fatigue. Secondly, as I mentioned previously, we can talk about circadian fatigue. The fact that there are times of the day when our alertness is lower. These are known as the windows of circadian low, or the WOCLs. Between 2 and 6 in the morning and between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, these are particular problem times of the day when our alertness is naturally low. But there are also times of the day when our alertness is much higher than normal. These are known as the forbidden zones for sleep. At around 9 in the morning and around 8 in the evening It is difficult to get to sleep and stay asleep. And for people who work shifts, who may have to sleep at times of the day when their alertness is naturally high, this can be a real challenge. The other types of fatigue I wanted to focus on are related to underload and overload. If we think about the situation where someone is driving on a motorway, for example, where we know that fatigue is much more likely, they may be experiencing underload or passive fatigue. And this is related to low workload, the boredom of driving for many hours, and the monotony of driving in unstimulating conditions. And then there is active fatigue or overload, the fatigue that results from high workload, the demands of the task being more than we can cope with, and the stress related to particular environmental conditions, such as heavy traffic. And I think once we start to think about fatigue in these terms, it helps us pinpoint the kinds of fatigue that are likely to be associated with our particular operation. So if you have drivers involved in long distance driving, then it's likely that passive fatigue may be a problem. If you have shift workers, it's likely that sleep-related fatigue and circadian fatigue are going to be an issue. And then we can start to think about the kinds of mitigations that we can put in place to prevent or reduce the consequences. The main contributors to fatigue typically relate to these four elements, and the extent to which operational practices or lifestyle issues affect our ability to obtain good quality sleep, to obtain sufficient sleep, and the extent to which our operational practices mean that we're awake for long periods of time, or that we're awake at times of the day when our alertness is reduced. Now, these four factors combine to cause fatigue or reduced alertness. But I think one of the big problems for many organizations is getting an understanding of the various contributors which will impact upon these four elements. So we can distinguish between shift-related contributors. For example, the timing of our duties, the duration of those duties. If we work shift work or shift patterns, the rotation pattern. Is it a forward rotating pattern, going from earlies to days to nights, or a backward rotating pattern? And then there's the predictability of the roster. We will have perhaps a published roster, but then on the day disruption, problems can affect the stability and the predictability of that roster. And then for some individuals, time zone travel can be a problem. And the main reason it's a problem is because of its effects on our circadian rhythms. Secondly, there are features of our work which can contribute to fatigue, high workload. But then thinking about the kinds of tasks that we're performing, then are there opportunities for napping? And what about the environment in which we're undertaking our work? Are the conditions, the environmental conditions, causing dehydration, for example? This could be an issue in hot countries. And then finally, pay. Sometimes we inadvertently incentivize people to work longer hours. We provide overtime, and that overtime means that people are encouraged inadvertently to, first of all, work more hours, but also perhaps to hide any symptoms of fatigue. If there's a financial benefit to working fatigued, then it's likely that people will continue to work even when fatigue may be an issue. The third set of factors relate to health and our chronotype. Our chronotype is whether we are a morning person or an evening person. A morning person, a lark, or an owl, an evening person. So chronotype has a significant impact on our ability to perform at different times of the day. And for shift workers, this can be a real challenge. If you are naturally a person who is best operating in the morning, maybe you'll struggle to work later duties or night duties. And then there are some of the other issues around health and medications. There are long-term health conditions which can cause fatigue. And then there are problems with some of the medications that we may use to treat those conditions. And finally, there are all of those issues which we have very little control over within the workplace. In other words, these are things that happen outside of the work. Our domestic situation. Are we sharing our home with multiple members of the family? Do we have extra responsibilities that may affect our ability to obtain sufficient sleep. And what about our environment in which we're sleeping? Is it cool? Is it quiet? Is it dark? These are issues which a training program can help improve. And then there are things that people do outside of work. What about second jobs and recreational activities, which may eat into the amount of time we give up to sleep? And finally, stress. All the things in our personal lives, our work lives, which can cause stress and which affect our quality of sleep. So there are a range of factors which cause fatigue, but they cause fatigue by impacting on one or more of these central 4 elements. And as you can see in this diagram, this can be very complex because these various contributors to fatigue interact. So just taking one, for example, if we look at quantity of prior sleep, you can see that there are at least 6 or 7 factors which all impact on our ability to obtain sufficient sleep. Now, for organizations, the challenge is identifying which of these contributors are likely to cause fatigue and then putting in place effective mitigations. Now, the reason fatigue has such an impact on performance is because the effect it has on the brain. We know that changes to the brain that occur when we're experiencing fatigue result in reduced alertness. We experience problems with maintaining vigilance and concentration. But in addition to that, fatigued people don't do what they're meant to do. They don't follow the normal rules. So if you have standard operating procedures, a fatigued person is much more likely to violate those procedures or not to comply with those procedures. And this is all about effort avoidance. We're taking shortcuts. Our brain is taking shortcuts to minimize the workload. But even when people are trying to do the right thing, when they're trying to follow procedures, when they're suffering from fatigue, they find it difficult to do this. So we may have the correct intention, but our ability to perform particular procedures can be flawed. And that means we're more likely to make slips or lapses. In other words, performing the correct action, but in an incorrect sequence, or maybe missing out one of the steps. And finally, when we're suffering from fatigue, we're much more likely to make decision errors. Our decision-making capability is affected by fatigue. And this means that we struggle with perception of risk. We underestimate the risk associated with particular situation. And nowhere is this more apparent than in driving. It's quite common for drivers who are experiencing fatigue to continue even when, were they properly rested, they'd realize that the risk to which they're exposing themselves is too much for them to cope with. But in addition to that, when we're suffering from fatigue, we resort to habit. We don't have the mental agility to consider alternative options. And so we do what we've always done in the past. So how does this translate into the effect on driving? Well, in the early stages, when someone is experiencing fatigue, there is a decreased attention to safety-related tasks. So simple things like keeping an eye on our speed or checking our mirrors are much less likely to be performed when we're experiencing fatigue. As the process continues, we start to stare vacantly at single points. Our visual scanning, in other words, looking out for other vehicles, starts to become impaired. Our speed profile changes. There's a delay in our changing speed, our reaction time is slower, and there is a tendency to drive slower and an unwillingness to overtake, possibly as a result of reduced alertness to the situation. As fatigue continues and becomes more severe, there are more significant consequences. Firstly, our steering responses become slower. Secondly, we start to move left and right within the lane. We find it difficult to maintain a straight line. Eventually, the vehicle crosses the center line or may veer off the road altogether. There's a general lack of awareness of our situation, and ultimately, we fall asleep at the wheel. We experience microsleeps, short periods of time when we are essentially entering stage 1 sleep. So that experience of head nodding, for example, is not just severe fatigue, that is falling asleep. It's entering stage 1 sleep. And the reason our head nods is because the muscles in the back of our neck have relaxed, which means our head nods forward. So in terms of the groups that are most at risk from fatigue, I mentioned earlier that men, particularly those aged under 30, are, for a variety of reasons, more likely to be exposed to fatigue. Secondly, shift workers, especially those working their first or second night shift, because perhaps they're transferring from working days to working nights, and they may start a shift already having been awake for a long period of time. Night shift workers also experience problems driving home. Obviously, they'll have been at work for long periods, they'll have been awake for a long period, and they may be driving at a time of the day when alertness is naturally low. Professional drivers, just because they are on the road for long periods, are more likely to be exposed to fatigue, as are company car drivers. But of course, company car drivers aren't regulated at all in the number of hours they can work. At least professional drivers do have some protection in terms of driver's hours rules. And finally, skilled manual workers, as I mentioned earlier, those who are driving long distances to get to work and then performing a hard, physically demanding day and then driving home again. All of these groups are overrepresented in the collision statistics. Before we finish, I just wanted to say a few words about some of the operational costs of fatigue. Obviously, collisions and crashes are the worst case scenario, but fortunately these are still by and large a rarity. But for organizations who have fleets of drivers, there are a whole range of other operational costs. If you have delivery drivers, for example, are they able to deliver good customer service? We also know that fatigue drivers use more fuel. There are also then all those bent metal costs, all those minor bumps and scrapes and broken wing mirrors, which we perhaps put down to driver inattention or distraction, but actually may have fatigue as a root cause. Because we know that we're much more likely to be easily distracted when we're experiencing fatigue. Obviously, this results in insurance costs, vehicles being out of service, which can cause delays. So on the left side of this iceberg, we have a whole range of operational costs. On the right side, we have the problems that result if we don't manage fatigue, all the problems that affect individuals. Poor morale, anxiety, stress, and depression. We know that if we don't manage fatigue and stress, they can combine to cause poor mental well-being of our driving workforce. Eventually, this leads to people taking days off sick, or simply taking days off without any particular good reason, or maybe even leaving the company. So our attrition rates go up. And this means that we have recruitment costs, extra training costs, and eventually the company gets a reputation for causing problems of fatigue. And this could be a reputation that potential drivers recognize, but it also could be a reputation that potential clients recognize. So all of these amount to increased costs for the operation. And I think the big problem for most organizations is that most of these costs aren't actually calculated. And unless you do quantify the cost of fatigue, there is no incentive to change. So in this quick introduction to driver fatigue, I've tried to highlight the following. Firstly, that fatigue is a physiological condition. It results from sleep loss, either not getting sufficient sleep on one particular occasion, or getting less sleep than we need for multiple days. It results from being awake for long periods of time. And then there are time of day factors, as well as workload. I distinguish between four particular types of fatigue. The fatigue that results from sleep problems, the fatigue that results from time of day, and the fatigue that results from underload or overload. In terms of fatigue contributors, I've distinguished between three types. Fatigue resulting from features of our shift patterns or our rosters, the fatigue that results from our work practices, and the fatigue that results from our health and lifestyle. I then went on to say that fatigue causes the problems it does because of the way that it affects our brain. When we're suffering from fatigue, it causes problems of reduced alertness. We're more likely to make errors. Our decision making is affected, and as a consequence, we're more likely to be involved in crashes. And so to summarize, many of the skills required for safe driving are severely affected by fatigue. I then went on to talk about some of the groups that are most at risk from fatigue. But of course, anybody can be affected by fatigue. And that's why we need effective strategies for identifying the causes and contributors to the problem. And finally, we looked at some of the costs of fatigue. So that finishes this quick introduction to fatigue. And later on, I'm going to look at some of the strategies we can use to improve the situation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to Paul there from TRL. That really interesting and useful presentation there, and very informative. We will now be joined by David Lee at Sleep Unlimited, who will be discussing obstructive sleep apnea and driving.
Hello there, everyone. My name is Dr. David Lee. I'm Clinical Director at Sleep Unlimited, and Break Professional have asked me to give you a talk today about some of the big issues affecting driver tiredness and driver fatigue in the UK and more broadly at the moment. Only got a short amount of time today, so I'm going to focus on something which I think is very important, the problem of sleep disordered breathing, or sleep apnea as it's called. So I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes going through some information about sleep apnea and give you a tool that we use to assess people, which I encourage you to go away and use that with your driving employees, because obviously there's some significant issues with that and their safety and their vigilance whilst they're on the road. So I'm Clinical Director at Sleep Unlimited, and we do a lot of training around the country on all aspects related to sleep, but we're working more and more now with fleet sector, as driver sleepiness is a particularly significant issue. I'm just going to go through my slides and then just to give you a little bit of a context, if you like, around the issue of sleep distorted breathing. At the moment in the UK, we've got about 1/3 of a million people diagnosed with disordered breathing or obstructive sleep apnea, OSA. But we think that there are many, many more people out there who have the condition but have yet to be diagnosed, around 1.5 million of people, in fact. So way over the number of people who we have with a confirmed diagnosis. And we think that if those people were assessed and treated, then we would see a reduction in the order of about 40,000 fewer road traffic collisions in the UK per year, and that might well save up to £55 million in direct costs. That's sort of relating to road crashes and treating comorbidities in people who've got a problem with their breathing whilst they sleep. And professional drivers, for a number of reasons which I'll go into shortly, are a particularly at-risk group for having a problem with sleep disordered breathing. So we're talking about a large number of people contributing to a lot of road crashes and costing an awful lot of money, not least say all the quality of life issues and social problems that we have following these road crashes. And there's not great data in the UK, but there's been quite a good study that was done in Australia a few years ago. Obviously, Australian drivers have more miles to drive. It's a larger country, but there's a reduced population compared to the UK. So we could maybe think that some of these costs are fairly equivalent. We don't have good data from the UK at the moment, but direct costs of diagnosing and treating sleep problems are quite significant, as well as the issues that people have with their sleep whilst they are at work. But it's the indirect costs which are really quite huge here, managing the aftermath of crashes and incidents at work. These add up to billions of dollars per year. Considering people who are driving and the risk that they might have for having a road traffic crash or an incident at work, we think that people who have obstructive sleep apnea are at a 2.5-fold increased risk, and that professional drivers, their risk increases again to a 5-fold increase over people who don't have this problem. They drive many more miles than non-commercial drivers. They tend to drive on arterial routes which are boring, and they are demographically an at-risk population. Most of them are men. The average age of a fleet driver in the UK is 53, so they're over 50, which is another risk factor, and I'll come back to these shortly. And also, we think around 84% of professional drivers are overweight as well. So there's another increased risk of having obstructive sleep apnea, which takes them up from this 2.5-fold increase to around 5. So we think that maybe up to 41% of professional drivers in the UK might have a diagnosable sleep problem, and that 16% may have such a severe problem that it requires some immediate attention. So what about the law? The DVLA in the UK stipulates that any driver who has obstructive sleep apnea must not drive. And if they do have moderate or to severe sleep apnea, then they can't drive. They have to tell the DVLA. They're not allowed to resume driving until they've had their symptoms controlled for 3 months, and they need reviewing every 3 years to keep their licenses active. So this is what the DVLA stipulates and has done for quite some time. If you are employing someone to drive for you under the Health and Safety at Work Act, you are responsible for them whilst they're driving. So that places a responsibility and a potential liability with the employer if you're employing someone who is known to have a problem with their sleep. And if you cause death by dangerous driving, and that includes driving when you're tired, then there's a potential for a 14-year prison sentence for an individual. But the liability in terms of compensation may well be directed to the employer. So we have a responsibility as employers to make sure that our drivers are safe while they are at work. And as we saw in the previous slide, there may be over 40% of them that might have an issue here and may be driving whilst tired, and 16% might have very severe apnea, so really shouldn't be driving at all. And that potential liability could sit with you as fleet managers. So what do we do about it? There are a range of different options for treating sleep apnea. It might be that someone has a lot of weight around their neck, and that squashes their airway and prevents them from breathing properly at night. This knocks someone out of their deep sleep, and it tends to make their sleep more disturbed, and they wake up feeling unrefreshed. And this is the problem. You need deep non-REM sleep to feel restored and refreshed and be functional the next day. So if you're reducing the amount of air that you intake during the night because you've got apnea, then that's why people wake up feeling rubbish and not performing well and being risky while they're at work or driving on the roads. So losing a bit of weight around the neck can sometimes help. We have got other things called mandibular advancement devices, MAD or MAD devices, which bring the lower jaw forward, and that helps to open the airway. We've got a lovely word, alveolovapharyngoplasty, which is a technique that involves laser surgery on the epiglottis in the throat to stop the epiglottis flapping around so much, which is the classic sort of snoring noise that you get. That's your epiglottis flapping around in the back of your throat. We can stiffen that up with scar tissue from laser surgery, and that can help as well. You can sometimes have tonsils removed, and often a lot of people are prescribed with a continuous positive airway pressure device called CPAP, which blows air through the oropharynx down in through the throat and into the lungs, keeps the airway open during the night, and people then get that deep sleep and feel very much better, and essentially it can normalize their risk. So we know that people who have obstructive sleep apnea and they use these CPAP devices and they comply with their use and use them regularly, they will get normal sleep back, and their risk goes from 5-fold back to 1. So the same as everyone else in the population who don't have sleep apnea. So we know that CPAP particularly effective intervention for managing sleep disordered breathing. However, most people don't get really good access to the diagnosis and then the treatment of obstructive sleep apnea, and that may be up to 85%. It's a postcode lottery, very much depends whereabouts in the country you are or your driver is, compared to the services that are available within the NHS. So this is really where we come in today, and this is the quick screening questionnaire that I want to introduce you to, and would really encourage you to go away and use this with your drivers. If you spot anybody who looks tired, go through this stop bang questionnaire with them, and there are scoring criteria attached to this, and I've just popped these up now for levels of risk. And if that person looks medium to high risk to you, then it's really worth going to the next level, which is a technique called overnight oximetry, and I'll be happy to talk to you about that more. I'll put our contact details up at the end. This is a service that we provide, but it's available in the NHS. You just have to wait longer for it. So the stop bang questionnaire, a simple screen. You can do this in 2 minutes with your employees, your drivers. Ask them, do they snore? If it's a yes, give them 1, no, 0. Are they tired? Again, 1 if they are, 0 if they're not. Has someone ever seen them stop breathing during the night? Again, 1 if they have, 0 if they haven't. Do they have high blood pressure? Yes, 1, no, 0. BMI, body mass index, are they overweight? Yes or no. Are they over 50 age? Do they have a large neck? So that's over 16 inches or 42 centimeters. Probably don't need to actually get a tape measure out. You can look at someone and determine whether or not they've got a large neck. And their gender is, are they male? Now, we know that most fleet drivers are male. We know the average age in the UK of fleet drivers is 53. We know that 86% of drivers are overweight. That's some data that was generated by Loughborough University, which I picked up at a conference run by the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport down at the Transport for London offices a few weeks ago. 86% are overweight. So we've already got 3 on here: overweight, over 50, male. If that person's got a large neck, we've already got 4. Some of these other questions: do you snore? Are you tired? Already we're getting way up into the medium to high risk. A lot of our drivers are ticking a lot of these boxes, and you'll know this yourself. You know, the drivers that you guys employ and ladies employ, you'll know that a large number of your fleet operators are going to be ticking a lot of these boxes. And if they're scoring up at 5, they're at high risk for having sleep disordered breathing, and that really needs looking at in more detail. So please take this screen away and use it with your employees, your drivers. And if you are at all concerned about them and their potential to have sleep disordered breathing, then please do get in touch with us if we can help, or encourage them to talk to their GP, because bear in mind, if they do have a sleep problem and they are driving, then there are potential liability issues. Having a crash on the road has significant other social and financial implications as well. So please go away and use this screen on your employees, on your drivers. And if you're at all concerned, then please do come back to me. I'll put my contact details up at the end of this presentation. I'll be happy to talk to you further. So just to summarize that brief talk we've been through today, it's a big problem. There are serious consequences when things go wrong, and that's financial, but also in terms of well-being for people involved in crashes or incidents on the road or at work. It's really quite an easy thing to identify. You probably got a few drivers in your mind now who you think, well, they've just ticked 5 or 6 of those boxes on the stop bang there. It's quite an easy thing to identify. And once we have identified those people, the procedures that we then go through to then make a more formal diagnosis and then provide treatment strategies is relatively straightforward. But people don't necessarily want to come forward because they might have to wait for a long time for that diagnosis and treatment. So part of what we're trying to do at Sleep Unlimited is to speed that process up so that people aren't off the road for a long period of time. And that's more convenient for you as the employer, but also for them, so they don't end up having long periods of time with reduced or lost earnings. It is a significant issue. There are a few recent crashes where tiredness has been implicated, and sleep apnea may well have been a factor here, because several of the people who were involved, the drivers involved, were ticking those boxes. I'm thinking about the bin lorry in Glasgow, the tram that went off the rails down in London, and also the Coventry bus crash just recently. Tiredness was implicated in all of those, and all of those drivers were ticking a lot of the boxes for sleep apnea. So please use that stop bang questionnaire and screen your workforce. It's quick and easy to do, and then if you have suspicion that they may well have sleep disordered breathing, then very easy to refer to the GP for that. Or if you need extra help, then you can come to us. We will provide further diagnosis and treatment advice as well for people if you want to speed that process up. There's just a little infographic there at the end. Again, I'm happy for Break to share this with you all just to raise awareness. It's an important issue, but it's under-recognised, and it costs a significant amount to society, both in financial terms and also in terms of well-being and managing the aftermath of crashes and incidents at work. We should be screening our drivers before they even get in the cab. We should be checking for this so that we can make sure that people, if they do have a problem, they get treated and they're vigilant, and then they won't make the mistake, they won't have the crash, and then they will save you as employers and society significant amounts of money and improve well-being. There's a whole host of references here if anybody's interested in looking into this in more detail. And if you have any further questions, then please do come back to me. We've got our contact details here. You can find us on the web, email us, or pick up the phone. And I'd just show you this last picture of an oximeter. If someone is suspected of having sleep disordered breathing, the next step is to confirm that diagnosis, and this is where we use an oximeter here, and you can see that that's strapped onto someone's wrist. It's about the size of a pack of playing cards, with a little lead that you can see coming out of the top here that extends to a little cuff that goes over the index finger, and that will measure pulse rate, here showing 68, and blood oxygen saturation, that's at 98%, so that's over 95%, so that's quite healthy. And we ask people to wear these for one night, and we'll see how their pulse changes during the night, but also if this blood oxygen saturation level dips significantly but below 90% for a significant period of time, then that will indicate that they have sleep disordered breathing, and that then requires treatment. So that's something that we can provide, but it's also provided through the NHS. Thanks very much for listening today. And as I say, if you've got any further questions, then please do come back to me, and our contact details are down here. And a final thank you to Break for, again, inviting me to come and talk to you today. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to Dr. David Lee from Sleep Unlimited. Some really important key messages and practical advice to take away from that presentation, especially the questionnaire, which is brilliant. So please do get in touch if you want to find out more about that. I would now like to introduce Steve Duffy, who will be presenting a case study explaining how Network Rail manage fatigue within their fleet.
Good afternoon. So my name's Steve Duffy from Network Rail, and what we do here is we tend to manage fatigue on our road vehicle fleet. So looking at what we do as a company, how do we manage driver risk? We tend to have certain controls in place where, if we look at one of the slides about what have we done, we have a fair culture policy introduced. So if any of our team members exceed their working hours, we have what we call an exceedance log. This exceedance log is filled in, and it is only filled in by managers that can make a decision on whether A, the work needs to stop and the individual goes into a hotel. They assess the work that person's been doing. They look at that. Has he had any breaks in the shift? Is he okay to work? Do we need to send them home? There's 15 or 16 different questions that they ask the individual. So when we get to site and our individuals book on at the workplace, they are asked 4 questions. When was the start of your journey? How far have you travelled? They then look at the equipment, what they're going to be using, and they assess that. And then when at the end of the shift, the time is noted, and how long does it take for you to get back to your place of rest? They then look at the permutations from the spreadsheet, and if that is the case, hotel accommodation is booked if it's too far. We then take that on board, book the hotel for the individual, and they then go back, have enough hours rest. There's 3 important things within Network Rail. To manage fatigue, they don't work more than 12 hours. They have to have more than 12 hours rest between shifts, and the travelling time cannot be more than 14 hours door to door. We have a Safety Central web page within Network Rail, and on that web page is our standards, our procedures, our policies. So if we look at the next one now, what have we done with regards to risk? So risk at Network Rail is that we like to get the individuals to travel by train. This takes out the problem of driving. If we have to drive anywhere, that really is a last resort, as people are encouraged to go by train, they're encouraged to take a taxi, they're encouraged to go the night before and stay in a hotel. We're trying to look at how to reduce the risk within the workforce. We have a policy of getting everybody home safe every day. Now, if we can do that, we have a duty of care. We've got life-saving rules, which means we cannot drive if we're tired. There's a whole raft of stuff in there. So most of our offices, as you'll appreciate, are next to railway stations. So taking the train really is the easiest option for the staff. Okay, so risk within Network Rail is that we have 6 areas which contribute to our driver assessment. So the first one is licence checks. We check people's licence before they drive the vehicle to make sure they've got the right category. We look at online assessment, where we do a driver wellbeing profile. That is done every 3 months, and what that does, that identifies any changes in your lifestyle, your work life. It highlights your perception and how you can drive the vehicle. Fuel, we only use diesel, so there's no way that we can fill up our vehicles with the wrong fuel. We've got a diesel only policy. Data, we run reports from management company with regards to the time of day. Health and safety policy, we are regularly updating that in line with our driver handbook. And the driver assessment is we have a training company which do that for us, and they come back and you get scored on your results. To manage risk, what we have in Network Rail is all of our vehicles are speed limited, so they're set to the national speed limit. And we have found within the past 18 months since we introduced telematics that we have seen a vast reduction in intended prosecutions, which are what we see for most people when they're rushing to get to work. So as you can see by the slide there, when we installed telematics to where we are now, we have seen a dramatic decrease in the issue of intended prosecutions on our owned fleet. On our rental fleet, we are talking to the rental provider to see if they can introduce speed limiters on those vehicles, which would then fall in line with our policy. The byproduct of putting the telematics system into the vehicle is that we have seen a saving on the amount of fuel that we draw from the fuel stations, which has resulted in over 2 million litres of fuel. Looking at the driver handbook, we have a new handbook and a code of conduct. So the handbook is split into different sections: what you should do, what you shan't do, how to do vehicle checks. It's got a code of conduct in there, and it's also got the checks that we insist that the driver does to the vehicle, which is our mandatory. Each driver handbook has got a tear-out page at the back, which the individual signs, and the individual hands to his line manager, and they sign it, and that is then kept by our team in Manchester for a record that they've read the book. To reduce fatigue in the vehicles, we've also introduced a new series of vehicles this year which have got safety standards and safety features included. So you can see there from the picture that's on the screen, we've got enhanced lighting, which helps the drivers. We've got audible warnings in the vehicle if they're going over the speed limit, if the vehicle is overweight. And each one of the vehicles has a sticker inside which denotes the speed limit on the road for that particular vehicle. So even though we've got speed limiters, you can still be caught speeding in a built-up area. That is about it.
Thank you very much to Steve there from Network Rail. A brilliant example of a fleet and how they are managing fatigue within their fleet. Some real life examples there for you to take away. So I hope you all found that extremely useful. We will now hear from Paul Jackson again, who will be discussing managing the risks of driver fatigue.
So having looked at the causes, consequences of fatigue, this final session is designed to help us understand some of the things that we as operators can do to manage the risks associated with driver fatigue. First of all, I'm going to look at the traditional approaches to managing driver fatigue, and I'll highlight why these, in isolation, are not an effective strategy for managing the problem. Secondly, I'll introduce an alternative approach, fatigue risk management. Thirdly, I'll look at one of the elements of a fatigue risk management system, and that's the use of fatigue models to predict or estimate the fatigue likely to be associated with shift patterns. And then I'll look at some of the other sources of data we can collect and analyze, which will help us understand the extent to which fatigue is impacting on our operation. So over the last 100 years, a variety of prescriptive regulation approaches have been taken to manage fatigue. And essentially, these are all hours of work limits. So we have driver's hours rules for professional drivers. We have, in the UK, domestic drivers' hours rules. And then we have the working time directive. All of these approaches focus on limiting the number of hours that an individual is allowed to work. And they set limits both on the hours of work, but also the breaks that have to be taken. Now, whilst these approaches have clear benefits in terms of being relatively easy to understand, unfortunately, in my view, they present a simplistic illusion that we're managing safety. And that illusion is, as long as you stay within these limits, you'll be safe. In many safety critical industries outside of road transport, at least in Europe, regulatory authorities are starting to introduce or require a more scientific approach to the management of fatigue. And this approach is based on an organization having proper understanding of the causes of fatigue inherent in their operational practices. The industry in which this is most advanced is aviation, but other industries such as mining, the oil and gas industry, the rail industry have all started to introduce fatigue risk management. And if we think about some of the contributors to driver fatigue, we can understand why prescriptive limits are ineffective. I distinguish between three types of contributor to driver fatigue specifically. There are operational contributors, all of those demands that are placed on our drivers. For example, there may be customer-driven key performance indicators that have to be satisfied as part of a contract. Delivery drivers often have very short delivery slots. Sometimes our delivery schedules can be unrealistic. Maybe they're based on historic data rather than the current road conditions. And all of that can cause stress and anxiety for a driver. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are problems with pay rates and how we're paying people, the structure of pay. Job and finish is a typical practice within road transport for delivery and long-haul drivers, truck drivers. And that can result in people rushing to finish work. And if we're paying people extra to work on days when they should be recovering or resting, then there is an incentive to work fatigued. Secondly, all those contributors related to our rosters. If we have a shift pattern which involves lots of early starts or late finishes, it's likely to cause problems for sleep. Drivers will typically get less sleep than they need on a daily basis. And if they're trying to sleep during the day, we know that the quality of that sleep is likely to be reduced. As a consequence, many people in the road transport sector use caffeine, energy drinks to stay awake. They'll work long hours, they'll work overtime, and they'll work on rest days. All of these have impacts on the amount of sleep and the quality of sleep that people are able to obtain. And thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, there are lifestyle contributors: sleep environment, availability or accessibility of good quality food, keeping hydrated, and then work-related health issues. We know that truck drivers, for example, are much more likely to experience problems with musculoskeletal disorders, back pains and neck aches. Then there are the lack of opportunities for exercise. It's a sedentary activity, and so drivers tend to be prone to putting on weight. Obesity can be a problem, and that leads to problems with sleep disorders such as sleep apnea. And then there's access to healthcare and social care. Because of the isolated nature of their environment and the fact that drivers are away from offices for long periods of time, they may not have the same access as other employees of an organisation. It is still a male-dominated profession, and we know that men are much less likely to seek help for mental health problems, but also for general health problems. Now, the problem here is that if we rely simply on hours of work limits to manage fatigue, we're only tackling one source of the problem, the number of hours that we're working. So many of the contributors that are listed on this slide are not addressed by hours of work limits. And it's for this reason that many regulatory authorities around the world have started to introduce fatigue risk management. Fatigue risk management is all about data. It's about using data to inform our understanding of the level of risk exposure associated with fatigue. It's about managing fatigue in a manner which is appropriate to our particular operational circumstances. In other words, whereas hours of work limits are a one-size-fits-all approach, this approach is tailored to the specific operational practices of the organisation. Now, we don't remove hours of work limitations. We simply use this as an addition to the protection offered by hours of work limits. But rather than just relying on compliance with those limits, fatigue risk management involves measuring our actual fatigue risk. A few years ago, some scientists in Australia put together this fatigue-related error trajectory. And I think it's a very useful way of thinking about the stages before we get to actual incidents or collisions. In other words, what can we do to prevent the worst case scenario of somebody falling asleep at the wheel? Level 1 is all about ensuring that there is an adequate opportunity for sleep. Now, hours of work limits should offer some protection in this regard, but when we're putting together rosters, shift patterns, we can evaluate the likely fatigue expected to result from those shift patterns. In other words, if I'm working a particular shift pattern, how able am I to get sufficient sleep? And I'm going to show you some examples of the kind of analysis that is undertaken. But of course, even where you give drivers the opportunities for sleep, there's no guarantee that they'll use that opportunity effectively. So the second level is trying to understand whether your drivers are using that sleep opportunity. Then we can start to look at some of the behaviors and the errors that are related to fatigue, and trying to understand whether there is evidence within our operation that fatigue-related behaviors and errors are apparent. And finally, where there are incidents, we need an investigation process to understand the contributors to that particular incident. Now, I'm going to come back to this slide later on and highlight some of the data that we can collect to help us meet each of these levels. But before I do, I just wanted to say a few words about one of the key components of fatigue risk management. And that is that fatigue risk management is all about shared responsibility. The idea that there are clear responsibilities both for the organisation and for the individual, in this case, the driver. And some of these map directly onto those levels that I've just described. So the first responsibility for management or for the organisation is to ensure that the rosters you provide your workers with allow sufficient breaks to enable recovery between duties or shifts. The equivalent responsibility for the individual is to make sure that they obtain adequate sleep. In other words, they use that opportunity to obtain sufficient sleep so that they are properly fit for duty. To enable them to do that, the second responsibility for management or for the organisation is to provide them with the information and tools to help them manage their personal fatigue risk. And typically this would be in the form of a training program to raise awareness of the dangers of fatigue, the consequences for performance, and the simple strategies that individuals can put in place to ensure that they get adequate sleep. The equivalent responsibility for the individual is to use that information to help them manage their out-of-hours activities so that they don't have a negative or adverse effect on work performance. And finally, there is a responsibility for management to treat seriously any reports of fatigue that are brought to their attention. Now, clearly this requires that we have a reporting system in place and that drivers are properly engaged with that reporting system. And that means we need a just culture. a non-jeopardy reporting system, because we want to encourage individuals to report both operational and personal factors that could increase their fatigue risk. Now, I mentioned that there are ways that we can predict fatigue using software, and there are a variety of fatigue models available which help us to provide an objective or science-based approach to scheduling. And we can look at our planned rosters, or we can look at actual hours of work, because obviously a planned roster simply sets out the base roster, but in actuality, many drivers and other employees will work more hours than that base roster. So there are a variety of software products available. They all have wonderful acronyms. The HSE Fatigue Risk Index is one of the ones available in the UK. And then there are commercial products, FADE, SAFE, FAST, and BAM. Whichever model you use, each model is estimating fatigue considering the same broad set of variables. So the way the models work is that you put the shift pattern into the software and it calculates a fatigue score, essentially, based on these variables. First of all, the length of each work period and the length of each break period. Secondly, thinking about circadian fatigue, they quantify the fatigue likely to be associated with working at that time of the day, but also the ability to obtain good quality sleep, depending on the time of day that the shift pattern is operating. The models typically look at the previous 7 days' work history, because we know that fatigue has a cumulative effect, and so we need to be thinking about the amount of recovery that's been possible over the previous week. So the fatigue I'm experiencing today is not just the result of what I did yesterday or the sleep I had last night, but it could also be affected by the previous 7 days of sleep and work. And finally, they look at the biological limitations, sleep and recovery. How much sleep do I need to recover from a particular type of duty? Now, over the next few slides, I'm going to show you some outputs from a couple of the different models that I've used in the past. I don't have any links with these model providers. They're simply presented here as examples of some of the outputs that you can obtain. Now, the one I'm showing you here is from a model called SafetyFast, and SafetyFast predicts fatigue and presents it in terms of performance effectiveness. The idea is that you have a scale on the left from 0 to 100, and this represents the percentage performance effectiveness. Essentially, it's a way of expressing fatigue. So the higher the score, the more effective your performance, the more rested and alert you will be. You can see that this is color coded. We have a red, amber, green color coding system. Green is obviously better, red is obviously worse. And the way that the model presents fatigue or performance effectiveness is to track it across each duty. So the black line shows our effectiveness when we're awake. The bold black lines are work periods, and you can see these are mapped at the bottom there. Those big black blocks show work periods. And then the blue line is our effectiveness when we're asleep. And again, this is mapped onto the bottom with those blue bars, which show sleep periods. So in this first example, you can see 3 day duties, 21st of July, 22nd of July, and 23rd of July. And then we have 3 night duties, 25th, 26th, and 27th, going into the 28th. Now, most of the models have some kind of performance threshold or effectiveness threshold or a fatigue threshold. And normally these are based on research which has highlighted that there is a link between fatigue and a comparable level of alcohol. In other words, research in the laboratory that has shown that after significant periods of wake, our alertness is similar to somebody with an alcohol level of between 0.05 and 0.08 blood alcohol concentration. So clearly we want to avoid going below that threshold. Here's another output from the same model. This one's a little clearer, and we can see we've got a block of 5 day duties, all commencing at 7 in the morning and finishing at 4 in the afternoon, followed by 2 days off, and then repeating that pattern, 5 more day duties and 2 days off. And what you can see here is that fatigue changes across each of those duties. And you can see that sinusoidal wave, the curve there, which replicates our circadian rhythm in alertness. With these day duties, you can see that all the duties are up in the green, and that's what you would expect. There is ample time for recovery between each duty, and the duties themselves aren't excessively long. In this example, however, we have a combination of days and nights. We've got 5 day duties at the start of the block, and then we have 2 days off, followed by 4 nights. And as you can see, the night duties are associated with a much higher level of fatigue, and that fatigue accumulates. In other words, across those 4 night duties, commencing on the 22nd of March, on the Friday, and continuing through to the Tuesday, our fatigue continues to accumulate. And as a consequence, effectiveness, performance effectiveness, goes well below that threshold represented by the dotted line. What this model also shows in this particular example is that 3 days off is not really sufficient to fully recover from those 4 night duties. So when we start the next block of day duties on around the 28th of the month, our alertness, our fatigue is already at a lower level than it was at the start of the previous block. This next output shows a different model. This is FADE, and in this particular model, what we've done is to look at the fatigue across a whole group of drivers. And each horizontal line, starting with a number on the left-hand side, the ID number, 520, 521, etc. Each one of those horizontal lines shows the shift pattern for a particular individual. It's using exactly the same type of analysis, but here we're representing fatigue across the whole group. And again, you can very quickly see where there are problems. So for example, if we look at ID number 565, we can see that the individual has a block of 4 day duties, and then their fatigue starts to change. Again, this is color coded. So green is good, broadly speaking. Yellow is starting to indicate problems, and then red is highlighting that there is a real issue with fatigue. So by the end of this block of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 duties, this individual is experiencing quite severe fatigue. So maybe we would want to look at that and make some changes. Now, of course, this is predicted fatigue. It's based on all of those variables I mentioned earlier. But this gives us an opportunity to make changes which will improve the situation. Now, when we undertake this kind of analysis, it enables the organization to consider how fatigue is distributed across the whole workforce. In this particular example, we're looking at the number of high fatigue duties associated with the operation and the number of employees who work those high fatigue duties. So the analysis has identified that there are certain duties that are associated with a high level of fatigue. And then we've looked at how many of the employees work one or more of those high fatigue duties associated with a high level of predicted fatigue. In the first column, you can see that over 140 employees didn't work any high fatigue duties across the year. But towards the tail, on the right-hand side, you can see there are individuals who regularly get assigned duties that are associated with a high level of fatigue. Now, once you've done this kind of analysis, you can start to distribute that fatigue more evenly across the workforce, rather than concentrating it on particular individuals, which is likely to have a very significant impact on collision risk. However, it's important to understand that a fatigue model in isolation is not a fatigue risk management system. A fatigue model is simply one element of a fatigue risk management system. And models make predictions about fatigue, and those predictions are based on average data for average individuals with an average sleep requirement. As a consequence, none of these are strictly right, but they do provide us with some understanding of the likely consequences of our shift work. But we also know that fatigue varies greatly between individuals, and some individuals are more susceptible to the effects of fatigue. So 2 individuals working the same shift pattern may have a very different experience. Unfortunately, models don't take any account of the impact of workload, and they also don't consider the work environment. The model doesn't know whether you are driving, sitting in an office, or sitting on the sofa watching television. They simply know that you are awake or asleep. So these are useful, but a fairly blunt instrument. But they do provide valuable objective data. They take the emotion out of that discussion about shift patterns. They provide a science-based approach to managing fatigue and fatigue risk. The fatigue-related error trajectory highlights the various sources of data that we can collect. And that first level we have addressed through the use of a fatigue model. But in terms of the other levels, what kind of data can we collect to help us understand the contribution? We might collect sleep information from our drivers, perhaps asking a group to complete sleep diaries, or maybe we have group discussions or surveys to understand how shift patterns affect our ability to obtain sleep. Are there differences between the amounts of sleep an individual is able to obtain when working day duties, night duties, or any other combination? In terms of that third level, in terms of identifying whether there's evidence of fatigue-related behaviours, well, again, surveys can help. A starting point is a fatigue awareness program to help individuals recognise the early warning signs of fatigue. And a key point here is that the fatigue awareness program should provide education not just on how to recognise signs of fatigue in oneself, but also how to recognise those signs in our colleagues. And ideally, I'd recommend that fatigue awareness program extends to the families of drivers, because often it's the families of drivers who are the most likely to spot those early warning signs, maybe a change in mood, or perhaps they'll recognise some of the warning signs of sleep apnea. We can also then look at HR data, human resource data. Is there a pattern of absenteeism or sickness rates? And is this related to particular shift patterns? In terms of the fourth level, identifying whether there is evidence of fatigue-related errors, well, the first thing we need is a just culture, a culture in which people feel comfortable to come forward, to hold their hands up and report instances of fatigue or contributors to fatigue. Sources of data could be employee reports, fatigue reports, but also in-vehicle telematics. Increasingly, large transport organisations are introducing telematics systems into their vehicles, which provide a whole raft of data. And much of this data could be very valuable if it's related back to time of day, shift patterns, overtime, and other causes of fatigue. And finally, where there have been fatigue-related incidents, do we have effective investigation procedures? And do those investigation procedures consider fatigue effectively? Over the last few minutes, I've tried to summarize some of the strategies we can put in place as organizations to help us get a better understanding of the causes of fatigue associated with our particular operational practices. I mentioned that hours of work limits in isolation are not an effective way of managing fatigue. In my view, they provide a simplistic illusion that we're managing safety. Simply by complying with those limits, we don't really get a good understanding of the extent to which fatigue is affecting our business. For that reason, fatigue risk management is a much more effective way of managing the problem. And fatigue risk management requires an operator to have a true understanding of what it is that they do that may be contributing to. And this provides us with data. And all of that data can be used to make informed, evidence-based decisions. In other words, we can look at our operational practices and establish exactly whether those practices are cost effective. One of the processes we looked at for identifying fatigue and predicting fatigue was the use of a fatigue model. And fatigue models help us understand the extent to which fatigue is associated with our work schedules. A fatigue model is not a fatigue risk management system, it's just one element of a fatigue risk management approach. I mentioned that fatigue risk management is all about shared responsibility. The understanding that both management and employees have clear responsibilities for managing and measuring fatigue. This approach offers clear benefits both to the operator in terms of understanding the true costs of what they're doing and giving them the opportunity to reduce those costs, as well as benefits to the individual in terms of a better work-life balance and increased safety. Thank you very much for your attention.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to all our speakers today. And we now have some time for some questions. Steve, I'm going to start with you. So in your presentation, you obviously highlighted the importance of implementing a comprehensive driver's handbook. Why do you think this is so crucial to combating driver fatigue?
Well, at Network Rail we have 32,000 employees, and people aren't different. We have graduates that come into the business every year. We've got experienced drivers, long service people that have been there 20, 25 years. And we thought a good starting point would be a comprehensive driver handbook to guide them through what we would like to see as professional people driving our vehicles. We have all this training available to make them better drivers, safer drivers, and more competent drivers. So that's the reason we took that.
Brilliant. And how can fleet managers determine the effectiveness or the reliability of their driver handbook? Do you have any tips if there are any particular fleets out there who either need to introduce this into their handbook or perhaps need to evaluate it?
It's very important to keep regular updates, to keep references for when you've updated it, references for when you're required to update by changes in law. And the important thing that we found from our side is that we spent an awful lot of money in the beginning having printed copies. Now it's on our local intranet site at work. You can pull that off any time of the day that you want to when you're logged onto the system. So for us, it's just getting the message out there that we are professional people driving an awful lot of miles each year for the company on company business, that we should be taking care of the asset that's given to you to do your job.
Can the new telematics devices you mentioned be used to monitor and address driver fatigue?
No, at the moment we're very, very heavily regulated within Network Rail.
Yeah.
So at the moment we can only get mileage from the actual telematics unit. We can use it as a GPS satellite navigation system, and we can also use it for our maintenance procedures to show when the vehicle goes into a garage for service, maintenance and repair. We have the facility on there for a lot more to do with the unit, but we have to go through our data protection panel and obtain union agreement before we can unlock anything else on it.
Yes, of course. And in terms of, obviously, you mentioned how you're trying to just get the message out there as much as possible. How has the reaction been from employees regarding the messaging? If you had interest in engaging conversations with them, are they very open to approaching the conversation now?
At the beginning, it was we done two trial depots. One was Bedford and one was, I think, around Preston, where we done some consultation with unions and the staff. They were all okay with it. When the units were fitted into the vehicle, it was seen as like a big brother thing that was coming in to monitor them. We had to do an awful lot of work with them to say, it's not monitoring you, it's not monitoring your driving, it's just there to give you a satellite navigation aid, and that was it really. We've had to take it very, very slowly with what we can do and what we can't do.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. So, Paul, we've a question come through, which is there much recent research of the prevalence of fatigue in the gig economy, especially delivery and taxi drivers?
I think that's a really interesting question. The gig economy is a real challenge as far as fatigue is concerned, because many people are working long hours in order to make ends meet. They are exposed to huge levels of stress in terms of demand, having to deliver hundreds of packages a day, and I think we're all a little bit complicit in that, particularly at this time of the year. We all want our deliveries next day, without really considering the impact on the individuals. There has been some research, not specifically looking at fatigue, but certainly looking at the impact of the gig economy on the individuals involved in that work, particularly delivery drivers. UCL conducted some research there. Professor Nicola Christie and Heather Ward have done some research which was really good very recently, which highlighted just how much of an impact the nature of that work has on the individuals who engage in it. So there is some work that's been done. I think there could certainly be more work which would highlight just how much of a cost this has on the humans who are engaged in the gig economy.
Yeah, so the next question, it might filter in with the question that you just answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Mhm.
Is any research being carried out in the real world with specific road transport operators, measure specific work and rest hours, and to potentially use that to then predict or identify risks?
There has been work around the world. A lot of that work tends to be conducted for a specific operator, so it's not necessarily work that can be shared.
Okay.
But yes, there is plenty of research. I've been involved in research for specific operators. I think where an organisation has taken that bold step to have a good understanding of the potential consequences of fatigue resulting from either operational practices or rostering practices, it leads to a step change in their approach to this issue, because they can start to then quantify the true costs of what they're doing and make more informed decisions about what is the appropriate way to go. So yes, there has been some research, but as I say, a lot of that's confidential. It's specific to particular operators.
What I found particularly alarming, obviously, in the first presentation that you gave was just the stats surrounding how many crashes are related to fatigue. And why do you think such a high percentage of fatigue-related crashes take place on motorways or on major trunk roads? Why is that?
Well, if we think about major roads and trunk roads, typically they're associated with a lack of visual stimulation. They're not most exciting environments to be driving. So as a consequence, the driving task tends to be less engaging. Drivers are much more likely, therefore, to experience passive fatigue. But in addition to that, the very nature of driving on those motorways and major trunk roads means that you are likely to be driving for long durations. There is a tendency for people to push on rather than taking a break. Without proper planning to identify somewhere where you can take a break, people push on. And once you start to get into that situation, then it's much more likely that fatigue is going to occur.
And why do you think it is that shift workers are so vulnerable to fatigue and its effects?
Well, I think shift workers experience a whole combination of the factors that contribute to fatigue. First of all, if you're working early duties or late duties, and especially if you're working night duties, typically you're going to be working at a time of the day when your alertness is naturally low. But you also may be trying to sleep when alertness is naturally high, which results in poor quality sleep. So especially if people are switching from one type of duty to another, that in itself is going to cause problems in terms of circadian disruption. In other words, the impact of shifting from operating at a particular time of the day to operating at a particular time of night. We know that has a significant impact on experience of fatigue as well. So shift workers really have a whole raft of problems associated with the activities they're doing.
So both you and Steve mentioned policies and driver handbooks in your presentations. Which initiatives do you recommend fleet managers integrate into their policies to ensure robust fatigue management decisions?
Well, I think each individual operator has to get an understanding of what the key contributors are to their operation. But I think Steve mentioned a couple of very useful elements of a fatigue policy. Things like, obviously, policies on number of hours of work that are permissible, but also policies on overtime. How many days of overtime are acceptable to the operation? And that's really about what level of risk you're prepared to accept. But then policies on things like extended duties. What is the procedure that kicks in when somebody is working over and above a certain level of hours? And then policies on reporting, policies on rest requirements, the importance of breaks and what to do in those breaks. All of these things can provide clarity for managers and for the employees. So I think those are some of the starting points, just to get a really good clear set of policies in place so everybody understands that this is an issue that is being taken seriously by the operation, and that everybody understands what their responsibilities are for managing fatigue in the first place.
And that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid, now with questions. But thank you very much to Paul and Steve for joining us for the Q&A today, and obviously to all our speakers for their presentations. which I'm sure you'll agree were really insightful, very clear and very interesting. Thank you very much again to Allianz for sponsoring today's webinar as well. And just to let you know, this is the last event of Brake Professional in 2018. Thank you very much to all of you who've joined us at our webinars, seminars, roundtables, conferences, etc. Throughout the year. And we will be making an announcement next week with all of the events for 2019, which is very exciting. So thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.